August 16, 1977, Indianapolis, Indiana. Moments before his final concert, a young reporter waiting backstage heard something she'd never expected from the king of rock and roll, quiet sobs. Elvis Presley was crying. She almost walked away, thinking it wasn't her place to hear. But when the lights came up and he stepped on stage, the truth behind those tears would change music forever. The Market Square Arena was alive long before the first note was played. More than 18,000 fans filled every seat, the air vibrating with anticipation and flashbulbs. Vendors sold souvenir programs stamped with gold letters. Elvis Presley, Summer Tour 77. Backstage, Evelyn Carter, a 24-year-old local reporter for the Indianapolis Gazette, clutched her press badge. She'd been granted 10 minutes for a post-show quote, a career first. But as she waited near the curtain, she heard something she couldn't explain. A soft sound, muffled, human. At first she thought it was a technician adjusting equipment, until she realized it was coming from behind the door marked private, Elvis only. She froze. The voice was low, breaking between breaths. A whispered prayer or a plea. She couldn't tell. Then a sob. Her instinct as a reporter told her to listen. Her heart told her to leave. She took one step back, then stopped as a security guard appeared. Tom Hensley, one of Elvis's longtime crew members, recognized her. "You shouldn't be here, Miss Carter," he said quietly. His tone was kind, not harsh. "He just needs a minute." "What's wrong with him?" she asked. Tom hesitated, then looked away. "Nothing you can print." The crowd roared from beyond the curtain as the orchestra started tuning. The band leader's voice boomed through the monitors. "Showtime in 2 minutes." Tom leaned closer. "Whatever you heard, you didn't." Then he walked off. Evelyn stood alone in the corridor, heart racing. She looked back at the door, then down at a small cassette recorder resting on a table. Its red light blinked softly. Recording. For a moment she wondered if he'd left it on by accident. Beside it lay a white scarf, the kind he always threw into the crowd mid-show. It was folded neatly, not tossed aside. Almost like a gift he never gave. Then the door opened. Elvis Presley stepped out. He looked exactly as the world expected, the white jumpsuit gleaming, the cape lined in silver. But his eyes were swollen, his expression distant. For half a second he met hers. Neither spoke. Then the stage manager called out, "Ladies and gentlemen, Elvis Presley." The crowd's roar shook the floor. He straightened his collar, took a slow breath, and whispered something under his breath that Evelyn caught only half of. "Let them feel the truth tonight." Then he walked onto the stage. The lights exploded. Trumpets blared. The king smiled for his people, but Evelyn knew what no one else did. Behind that smile was a man who'd been crying minutes earlier. She stepped closer to the curtain, press badge shaking in her hand, and watched him through the slit. His voice filled the arena like light breaking through a storm. He wasn't just performing. He was holding himself together. Every lyric of "If you love me, let me know" sounded like a confession. Every smile was a shield. The fans saw a legend. Evelyn saw a man saying goodbye. Have you ever watched someone pretend to be fine when you knew they weren't? That's what it felt like. Standing in the shadows while the world cheered for a heart that was breaking. And somewhere behind that door, a tape was still recording. Evelyn's hands were still trembling as she slipped deeper into the backstage hallway. The crowd's roar thundered through the walls, but back here it sounded distant, hollow, like waves echoing through a tunnel. She couldn't stop thinking about what she'd just heard. Elvis Presley, the man millions worshipped, crying alone before walking into history. She turned back toward the dressing room door, the one marked private. The hallway was empty now. Something inside her whispered, "Go." She pushed the door open, slowly, just enough to peek inside. The room was small, surprisingly plain. A single mirror framed by yellow bulbs, a table littered with paper cups, vitamin bottles, and a half-empty water jug. The air was heavy with cologne and the faint trace of cigarette smoke. On the vanity sat that same tape recorder, its red light still blinking. The cassette spun quietly inside. She took one step closer. There was a sound, faint breathing, then a voice. His voice. Lord, Elvis whispered on the tape. I don't know if I got anything left, but if tonight's my last one, let it mean something. Evelyn froze. Her throat tightened. This wasn't a performance. It was a prayer. Outside, the announcer's booming voice echoed through the speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, the king of rock and roll. The crowd erupted again. 18,000 people screaming while one woman stood in a room holding the truth he left behind. The tape clicked softly and stopped. She looked around the room. Everything felt untouched, personal. The robe slung over the chair, a small Bible open to Psalms, a folded napkin with words scrawled in pen. Let them remember the man, not the myth. Her heart pounded. She should leave. This was sacred. But part of her couldn't. She picked up the scarf lying beside the Bible. Ivory, with a faint trace of stage makeup on the corner. It smelled faintly of cologne and sweat, like the ghosts of every performance before this one. Then the door creaked. She spun around, and there he was. Elvis stood in the doorway, backlit by the stage glow. He didn't look surprised, just tired. He smiled faintly, like he'd expected her. You're the reporter, right? From the Gazette. She nodded, words stuck in her throat. I was just waiting for the post-show interview. He chuckled softly, a dry sound. Don't worry, darlin'. I ain't mad. You heard it, didn't you? Evelyn's breath caught. I didn't mean to. He raised a hand gently. It's all right. Maybe you were meant to. The muffled sound of the orchestra warming up carried through the walls. He turned toward the mirror, fixing his collar in silence. You ever feel like you gave the world everything? He said, eyes still on his reflection. And somehow lost yourself along the way? Evelyn didn't know what to say. She could only whisper, yes. He smiled again. Not the grin from posters, but something fragile, real. Then you understand. A stagehand appeared suddenly at the door. Mr. Presley, you're on. He nodded, then looked back at Evelyn. Keep the tape safe. Sometimes the truth needs a witness. And before she could respond, he was gone, swallowed by the sound of applause and horns. The curtain fell shut behind him, and Evelyn stood there, clutching the scarf and staring at the small tape recorder still warm to the touch. Her fingers hovered over the stop button. What would you have done? Pressed it? Or let the truth stay buried in silence? Because some truths feel too heavy for the world to hold. The lights hit him like sunlight through stained glass. Blinding, holy, and cruel. Evelyn stood half-hidden behind the curtain, watching Elvis Presley walk onto that stage as if stepping into his own legend. 18,000 voices rose in unison, chanting his name. Elvis! 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 The brass section thundered, drums cracked, and the king raised one hand in greeting. To the audience, he looked immortal. But Evelyn could see it, the slight tremor in his hand, the heaviness in his steps. He took the mic, smiled, and said his usual line, "It's good to be here tonight, folks." The crowd went wild. But his eyes didn't sparkle like before. His voice, though strong, carried something fragile beneath the surface, the weight of a man trying to sound unbreakable. The first few songs rolled out like clockwork. C.C. Ryder, Love Me, all shook up. Each met with waves of screams, scarves, and flashbulbs. But between songs, he seemed to drift. He'd glance toward the side curtain, where Evelyn stood. Not directly at her, but past her, as if he were looking through time. Then came My Way. He always saved it for late in the set, but tonight he started it early. When Glenn Harden hit the first piano chord, something shifted. The audience roared. They knew this was the one. Elvis closed his eyes, and for a moment, the stage lights dimmed to a soft gold. And now, the end is near. His voice was steady at first, smooth as silk, but by the second line it cracked raw, human. The crowd erupted in applause, thinking it was passion. It wasn't. It was pain. He clutched the mic tighter, breathing hard between phrases. Sweat glistened on his temples. His movements slowed, no signature hip shake, no theatrics. Just a man standing still, singing his truth in front of thousands. Evelyn could see his lips tremble on the word regrets. The horns softened. The drummer watched him, waiting for the cue that never came. Elvis opened his eyes and whispered into the mic, "I did it my way, didn't I?" The crowd screamed, "Yes," without realizing he wasn't talking to them. He looked up at the ceiling, eyes glassy under the spotlights. It wasn't a concert anymore. It was confession. Halfway through, he missed a line. The orchestra hesitated. Instead of singing, he smiled sadly and said, "You all know the words." The audience sang for him, thousands of voices filling the silence where his should have been. Evelyn pressed her hand to her chest. She'd covered dozens of live shows, but she'd never seen anything like this. The power wasn't in his perfection. It was in his breaking. By the time the song ended, he stood motionless, eyes closed, head bowed. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "Thank you." The band played the outro, but the applause drowned it out. It wasn't a wild cheer. It was something deeper, quieter, reverent. Joe Esposito watched from the wings, whispering to another crew member, "He's running on heart tonight." Backstage, some of the younger staff cried without knowing why. They just felt it, the sense that something final was unfolding. Elvis wiped his forehead with a towel and laughed softly into the mic. "Y'all are too kind," he said. "You make an old man feel young again." The crowd cheered, but Evelyn caught the tone. He didn't sound grateful. He sounded like someone saying goodbye. Then he turned, handed the mic to the stand, and whispered into it, "Let's give them one more for the road." The band rolled straight into Hurt. His voice exploded through the speakers. Deeper, stronger, desperate. Each note sounded like it was tearing out a piece of him. "I'm so hurt." The word echoed through the rafters, through every heart in that arena. You could feel the collective shiver, the weight of something sacred happening before your eyes. When he hit the last high note, the arena went silent. No one even clapped. Felt wrong to break the moment. He lowered the mic, staring out at the sea of faces, the same faces that had adored him for 20 years. Then, so softly the sound man almost missed it, he whispered, "I hope you forgive me." The house lights dimmed to black. Evelyn felt her knees weaken. She wasn't sure if she'd imagined that last line, or if the entire crowd had just heard a goodbye hidden in a song. Because sometimes, farewells don't come as words. They come as music that sounds like prayer. The applause for Hurt still shook the rafters when Elvis gave the band a small hand signal. One they didn't recognize. Glenn Harden, the pianist, blinked. "What's he doing?" he whispered to the drummer. Elvis didn't turn around. He kept his head low, eyes on the microphone. "We're changing it up," he said softly. The crowd cheered, assuming it was part of the show. But the band froze. That phrase, "changing it up," wasn't on the set list. Joe Esposito stepped forward from the wings. "What's he planning?" Elvis ignored him. He adjusted the mic stand, closed his eyes, and spoke to the audience for the first time that night without a rehearsed smile. "You know," he began, his voice quieter now, "sometimes we sing songs so many times we forget why we sang them in the first place." The arena fell silent. He took a deep breath, wiped his forehead with a towel, and said, This one's for anyone who's ever tried to find peace when the lights go down." Then, without another word, he motioned to Glenn. The first few chords rang out, slow, soft, familiar, but wrong somehow. Evelyn frowned, recognizing the melody. It was Peace in the Valley, a gospel hymn he hadn't sung in public for nearly a decade. The fans recognized it too. The cheers turned into a hush. Elvis's voice entered, deep and trembling. "Well, I'm tired and so weary, but I must go along. No brass. No drums. Just piano and his voice, the kind of voice that didn't need a microphone to feel enormous." He wasn't performing now. He was praying out loud. Evelyn gripped the curtain edge, tears burning her eyes. She could feel the shift ripple through the arena, that invisible moment when entertainment turns into something holy. As he reached the second verse, his tone cracked. The audience collectively held its breath. Then, instead of powering through like he used to, he stopped. He looked out into the darkness beyond the stage lights. "You ever wonder," he said softly, "if maybe we spend so much time trying to be loved, we forget how to love ourselves?" The crowd stayed utterly silent. You could hear the hum of the amplifiers, the soft whir of the ceiling fans. Evelyn wrote those words in her notebook without realizing her hand was shaking. Elvis smiled faintly. "Not sad, not happy, just tired. I used to sing this song to my mama," he continued. "Guess I forgot how much I needed it." He turned slightly, as if speaking to someone who wasn't there. "I hope you're listening, Mama. I'm coming home soon." A woman in the front row gasped. People started to cry. He sang the next line softer than before. "There will be peace in the valley for me." By the final verse, half the crowd had joined in. Not screaming, not chanting, just quietly singing along. The cameras in the back caught something strange. Elvis smiling, a single tear rolling down his cheek. When the song ended, he didn't bow. He didn't say thank you. He just stepped back from the mic, placed his hand over his heart, and whispered, "Amen." Then he turned and walked off stage. The lights didn't fade right away. The orchestra didn't know what to do. The audience remained standing. No applause, just stunned silence. Even the security guards looked at each other, unsure if the show was over. Backstage, Joe grabbed him gently by the shoulder. Are you okay?" Elvis nodded, eyes still glassy. "That one wasn't for them," he said quietly. "It was for her." Joe frowned. "Her who?" Elvis didn't answer. He just handed Joe the towel and walked into the dressing room alone. The door closed softly behind him. Evelyn stood in the hallway, frozen. She could still hear the faint echo of that final amen ringing in her ears. Have you ever seen a man find peace in front of thousands and realize it might be the last time? Because that night, the king didn't just sing a song. He laid down his crown. The dressing room door shut with a soft click, and the sound of the crowd outside began to fade into distant thunder. Evelyn stood alone in the hallway, notebook clutched to her chest. Her hands still shook from what she'd just seen. No journalist training had prepared her for this, to watch a man the world called a god sing like he was asking for forgiveness. She turned toward the same room she'd been in earlier, the one marked private. The sign still hung crooked, the light above flickering weakly. When she pushed the door open, the smell hit her first. A mix of sweat, aftershave, and faint cologne. The air was still warm. The room looked untouched, as if time had paused when he left. The tape recorder was still there, sitting on the vanity, its red light now blinking slower, signaling the cassette was near its end. She hesitated. The words he'd said before the show echoed in her head. "Keep the tape safe. Sometimes the truth needs a witness." Her hand hovered above the button. Then she pressed play. The machine whirred and the room filled with static. Then came his voice, soft, weary, human. "Lord, I ain't sure how many more I've got in me," Elvis said. "The crowd still cheer, but I can't feel it like I used to. I hope I made you proud." Evelyn's heart clenched. She turned up the volume slightly, afraid to miss a word. He continued, the tremble in his voice more pronounced. "They see the rhinestones, the lights, the jumpsuits. They don't see the man inside it. Maybe that's my fault. I built it that way." He chuckled, just a faint, broken sound. "Guess I wanted to be loved so bad. I forgot what love was." Her eyes filled with tears. Every word felt like a confession not meant for anyone else to hear. Then came a pause, long enough that she thought the tape had ended. But it hadn't. His voice returned, softer now, almost like he was talking to someone beside him. "Mama always told me, son, don't let the world take your soul. Guess I let it borrow it for too long." A chair creaked, the faint sound of movement. "Tom says the press is here tonight. Maybe they'll write about the show. Maybe they'll call it a comeback." He laughed again. "But you can't come back to something you never left. The stage is home, but home's empty without peace." Evelyn wiped her face. She didn't even realize she was crying until she saw the tear stain on her notebook. Then, near the end of the tape, his tone shifted. It wasn't despair anymore. It was calm. "I just want folks to know I found it," he said. "The peace Mama prayed for. It took me a lifetime, but I found it." There was a long silence after that. The tape hissed softly, like wind over water. Then one final line, "If this is the last one, tell them I was ready." The recorder clicked off. Evelyn sat down on the chair, unable to move. She'd come here looking for a story, and instead, she'd been handed a man's goodbye. She rewound the tape once, then pressed play again, listening through tears. His voice filled the small room like a ghost refusing to fade. She wanted to tell the world, but something stopped her. This wasn't meant for headlines. It was meant for history, for the truth that would outlive ink and microphones. Outside, the sound of sirens wailed faintly in the distance. An ambulance leaving the arena. Her pulse quickened. She didn't know why, but her gut twisted. She grabbed her notebook, stuffed the cassette into her bag, and ran for the exit. The roar of the crowd had died down completely now. The night air outside was heavy, still. That's when she saw the stage manager running across the parking lot, shouting into a radio. His face was pale. Something had happened. Something big. And in that instant, Evelyn realized. She might be holding the last words Elvis Presley ever spoke. What would you have done if you were her? Protect the secret or let the world hear his truth? 25 years later, Memphis was quiet. The morning sun glowed against the white columns of Graceland, and the smell of magnolia drifted through the gates. It was August 16, 2002, the anniversary of the day the king had gone home. Evelyn Carter was no longer a young reporter. Her hair had turned silver, her voice softer, but the fire in her still burned bright. She lived in a small house near the Mississippi River, surrounded by stacks of old notebooks and one wooden box locked with a brass latch. Inside it sat the cassette, the same one she had taken from that dressing room all those years ago. She hadn't listened to it in decades. Not once. Some nights she'd wake up, tempted to play it again, to hear his voice one more time, but she always stopped herself. "It wasn't mine to use," she'd whisper. "It was mine to protect." Then came the letter. It was from the Graceland Historical Trust, requesting her assistance for a documentary on Elvis's final performance. They'd heard she'd been there. They wanted her memories. She almost declined, until she saw the final line of the letter. "We'd like to include any first-hand materials, tapes, or notes you may have preserved." Her heart pounded. She opened the box, pulled out the old cassette. The label had faded, but the word August 16th was still visible in blue pen. After all those years, it still felt alive. A heartbeat trapped inside plastic. The next week, she flew to Memphis and met with a man named Charles Reno, a historian from the Presley estate. They sat in a small studio filled with golden records and framed photos. When she handed him the tape, his hands shook. "Where did you get this?" She smiled faintly. "He gave it to me, not in words, but in trust." They played it together. At first, there was static, that soft hiss that sounds like time itself breathing. Then came the voice, that same low, trembling voice. "Lord, I just hope I made you proud." Charles's eyes widened. "Is this?" Evelyn nodded slowly. "It's real." When the recording reached the final words, "Tell them I was ready," neither of them moved. A silence followed, deep and reverent. It took months for the Presley estate to authenticate the tape. Forensic experts confirmed it matched Elvis's voice and microphone type from that night. News of the discovery spread quietly. No tabloids, no exploitation. Just whispers of something sacred being found. The estate decided to share it once, during a private broadcast on August 16, 2003, 26 years to the day since he died. That morning, Graceland's meditation garden was filled with thousands of fans. Candles lined the pathways. The air was thick with reverence. Evelyn sat in the front row, the same tape now restored and playing through hidden speakers. When his voice filled the air, people wept openly. They see the rhinestones. They don't see the man. Some bowed their heads. Others held hands. It didn't sound like a celebrity anymore. It sounded like a soul saying goodbye. When the recording ended, the crowd didn't clap. No one moved. Then, one by one, they began to sing softly without prompting. Peace in the valley for me. Thousands of voices, all humming his last song, rising into the warm August air. That moment became known around the world as the King's Prayer. News outlets picked it up a week later, not as scandal but as history. Rolling Stone wrote, "He didn't just leave behind music, he left behind mercy." A plaque was placed near the meditation garden shortly after. It read, August 16, 1977, Market Square Arena, final performance. He found peace before the final note. Evelyn stood there after the ceremony, wind brushing through her hair, listening to the echoes of the crowd, still singing softly beyond the gates. She whispered, "You did make him proud, Elvis." For the first time in decades, she felt free to cry. Because the world finally knew what only she had heard. The king's last words weren't about fame, or fear, or regret. They were about peace. And somehow, in sharing them, she'd found hers too. Years passed. The world changed. Vinyl became digital. The Memphis skyline filled with lights Elvis never lived to see. But his final words, captured on that fragile tape, never lost their echo. For decades, fans kept returning to that single line. "If this is the last one, tell them I was ready." To most, it sounded like acceptance. But to those who listened closer, it was something deeper. It wasn't about death. It was about peace. In 2017, on the 40th anniversary of his passing, a documentary aired worldwide, Elvis, The Last Prayer. It featured rare footage, photographs, and, at its heart, the very tape Evelyn Carter had protected for nearly half a century. The narration opened with that haunting whisper. And when the words faded, silence filled living rooms across the world. Even younger generations, kids who never knew his music, sat in awe. Because in those words, they heard something universal. The exhaustion of carrying a crown too heavy for one soul. Reporters who'd once written about his excess and tragedy now wrote about his redemption. One headline read, "He left the stage, but not the truth." Evelyn watched the premiere from her small living room in Mississippi. The tape deck still sat beside her chair, old, scratched, but still working. She hadn't touched it since the day she gave the master copy to Graceland. When she heard his voice again, broadcast across the world, she whispered the same thing she'd said all those years ago. "You did it your way, and you found peace." She smiled through tears, because that was the truth no camera could ever capture. Behind the gold records, behind the noise, behind the endless myth, was a man who just wanted to go home clean. Later that week, she visited Graceland again. Thousands gathered for the candlelight vigil. The air glowed with soft orange light. People of every age stood together, singing "Can't Help Falling in Love." And there, beneath the plaque, lay a single item no one claimed credit for. An old cassette, wrapped in a white handkerchief. Written on the label in faded ink, "For the man inside the crown." Evelyn knelt down beside it, a soft smile forming. "You're still talking to them, aren't you?" she whispered. A little girl nearby asked her, "Did you know him?" Evelyn looked up at the child, the next generation who'd never seen him live but still knew every lyric. She nodded gently. "We all did, even if we didn't realize it at the time." The little girl smiled. "Mama says he had the kindest eyes." Evelyn's own eyes softened. "Yes, baby, he did." As the crowd sang, she looked toward the mansion, windows glowing softly under the Memphis moon. And for a brief second, she thought she saw a shadow at the top window, a silhouette, just standing, watching. She didn't blink. She didn't want to break the illusion, because maybe legends don't die. Maybe they just rest in the hearts of those who still listen. She pressed her hand to her chest, whispering a final line to herself, the same one he'd said into that recorder all those years ago. Sometimes the truth needs a witness, and she had been his. The next morning, the Memphis Gazette ran an editorial headline that read, "He sang for the world, but he prayed for himself." Beneath it, a quote from Evelyn's final interview. "Elvis taught us that peace isn't in the applause, it's in forgiveness. And sometimes, the greatest act of love is letting go." The world didn't need another king that day. It needed a man who reminded everyone that even the brightest lights fade with grace. And somewhere, beyond the lights of Memphis, the echo of his voice still lingered, warm, human, and free. If the story moved you, share it with someone who still believes music can heal the soul. Because Elvis's last words weren't just about leaving, they were about finding. Finding peace after fame, finding love after loss, finding truth in silence. And maybe that's what all of us are searching for. So tonight, when the noise of the world fades, listen closely. You might still hear him, that gentle voice whispering from another time, "I was ready, were we?"